my take-home message is, if I want anyone to remember anything, is that precision feeding can decrease the environmental impact, can decrease feed costs by 12%, and it can help us to have new generations of producers in the field.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Patience, and I'm the host for today's podcast, in which we're going to discuss precision feeding of growth-finished swine. And I'm delighted that we have a particularly capable and experienced guest with us today to talk about this subject. And her name is Dr. Aline Remus, and she's with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Sherbrooke, Quebec. So welcome, Aline.
Thank you for having me, John.
Very well. Certainly am delighted to have you join us today. I've seen your name around so much in the last few years, but I've never actually had a chance to meet you. So this is a real pleasure and honor for me. You clearly have some wonderful training and skills that you're working on. I love the research that you're involved in, things like modeling. I'm a huge fan of modeling, but many people that are listening today may not be familiar with your background and your current research. So perhaps you could briefly explain your background and your experience in swine nutrition.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I didn't end up here by coincidence. One of my first memories is in the pairing with my dad. So we didn't synchronize the cycle at that time. So I would be with them during the night while they watch it. They would make a bed for me in the corridor, and I'll be there. And I remember doing that when I was 5, 6, So my first real job was taking care of the maternity, and I was 12 years old. So I would take care of applying iron on the animals, the castration, everything that you can imagine that going on there. So I really grew up in that that environment. And I really, every time that we're gonna do something new, I always think in what my dad would think. So what the producer would think. And when I was maybe 14, I moved out. I went to study in a technical school, was 120 boys and 5 girls. And I was one of the 5 girls who graduated from there. And by that time, I was convinced that I wanted to go to veterinary school. So I did my final internship and with a vet. I was working with large animals, especially dairy cows. And I was miserable. I was really miserable. And I always remember she telling me, people have this idea that being a vet is this romantic thing. And I think what you want is to see happy animals, right? And it's like, yeah, it's exactly what I want to do. And she said, well, you should be in animal science then. And it's how I ended up doing my undergrad in animal science. I went to a university in the south of Brazil. I specialized in non-ruminant nutrition there. And I started working as an undergrad in modeling group with Dr. Lovato, who introduced me to Dr. Pomar. And as an undergrad, I started my first projects with Dr. Pomar. And I remember the first presentations that I saw in precision feeding, I said, this guy he had no idea what this feed production is. We can never do that. How are we going to feed individual animals? And by the end of the presentation, he had convinced me that is what I wanted to do for my master and for my PhD. So I continued working my undergrad. I did my master in São Paulo University. I worked with methionine requirements for precision fed pigs. I also did some modeling that time. And when I finished my master, I found some very peculiar results in terms of methionine requirements. And I came up to Candido during my internship here in Agri-Food Canada, and I told him, the precision feeding system doesn't work like the phase feeding system, and you have different methionine requirements. And his first reaction was like, cannot be, must be something wrong. So come to Canada, do your PhD here, and let's work in amino acid requirements for precision feeding. So I did my PhD in precision feeding, always comparing with group phase feeding. And by the end of my PhD, what came out was that precision fed pigs really have different requirements in terms of amino acid profiles than base fed pigs, mainly because they're not doing the same thing with the amino acids as the group fed pigs. So I decided to pursue a postdoc in this area. I went to the Department of Biology of the University of Sherbrooke, and I decided to go for a nutrigenomics approach. So I wrote down some grants with Canada, and we went to look how pigs that have the same body weight, the same genetic background, how they're using glucose. We had a PhD student working on it, a very brilliant guy, and I did the amino acid trial with levothyroxine to try and understand what was going on with these animals. So I have been in and out this field for 10 years now, and I was just hired as a permanent researcher in the last fall here in Edinburgh, Canada, to replace Dr. Pomar. So big shoes to fill. And that's pretty much my background.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Aline. And I'm noting that you're one of the increasing number of students who are coming from Brazil who have received some of their training or all of their training in Brazil, and they're now establishing themselves in careers in Canada, the United States, and beyond. And I that must be showing a maturation of education and research that's going on in Brazil compared to maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So that points to an exciting future as well, that by itself. So thank you very much for that. But let's get into the topic at hand, which is precision feeding. So let's start out by, Aline, can you please define for us what precision feeding really is in your mind?
So precision feeding is the act of feeding daily tailored diets for a small group of animals or for an individual animal. When we're talking about a small group of animals, I'm talking about being able, for example, to tailor the diets for each pen. So you have, 200 pens, and you can make 200 diets every day. So every day you can change the diet for each one of these pens. When I'm talking about individual precision feeding, I'm talking about formulating a diet that meets the requirements or closely meets the requirements of each pig every day. So normally when I say that, people say, well, you probably need a lot of feeds to do that. It's very difficult to put that in the field. But what we do is to actually formulate two diets. One that is very, two feeds actually, sorry. Here is very important to be precise, right? So, so we formulate two feeds. A one that is very concentrated in nutrients. Actually, when I say nutrients, I'm talking especially amino acids, calcium, phosphorus. We have not worked with microminerals. We have not changed the energy of the diet. So just keep in mind amino acids and calcium, phosphorus. And we formulate this concentrated diet for the most demanding pig in the first day of growth. And we have a very low concentration, low density diet that is formulated for the least demanding pig on the last day of growth. And every day we use a model. So our model, it captures real-time feed intake and real-time body weight of these animals until midnight yesterday. Let's say we have feeders, equipments that can capture this information. And then they capture the data until midnight. And then we do a very short prediction within the day. How much is the feed intake that we expect for this animal today? And how much is the growth of this animal for one day? So our window of prediction is very short, which means that's much easier to predict than if we will do like a over time prediction when we start to have a lot of problems modeling that growth. And when we do that, we then know which is the requirement in lysine for each one of the for each one of the pigs, and by relationship, we provide all the other amino acids in the diet for each one of the pigs.
Okay, good. That's a great start, and it's brought up a question in my mind, Aline, as you were describing there, that you're feeding. The one way to apply this commercially would be to just have two diets. You don't need 20 diets. You just have two diets, and you blend them together relative to the requirement of the specific pigs you're feeding, whether it's an individual pig or a pen of pigs or a group of pigs. So that makes sense. And then you said that the two diets would differ in their amino acid concentration. They would differ perhaps in their calcium and phosphorus concentration, that they would not change in their energy concentration and would not change in vitamins and trace minerals. Is that correct? So that raises a technical question in my mind, which I've wondered about for a long, long time. If we're feeding two pigs that differ in their protein accretion rate and their protein to lipid ratio, and so their amino acid requirements are different because they're growing faster or slower, does the energy requirement stay the same, or does it differ? Because I'm assuming that the slower growing pig eats less feed, not always, but generally. So I'm curious why the energy concentration stays the same when everything else is different.
That's a fantastic question. And the short answer is just because we didn't get there yet. But that's
okay. Okay. Yeah.
We're still in baby steps, but that is one of our coming projects is actually to try and manipulate this energy of the diet and see if we can actually manipulate the growth of the animals. Because we have seen that when we change the amino acid content of the diet, we can change different proteins in the body. So we are also wondering, can we manipulate these animals to have a different growth? We haven't seen much of difference in lipid deposition when we're using precision feeding, because as you say, when we use precision feeding, we are actually decreasing, depending what is your standard, we're sometimes decreasing by 40% the protein in the diet. So you could think in a low protein diet, and what we normally see is fat deposition in those cases, right? But we haven't seen much of that. When we arrive to the very late pigs, and when I say very late pigs is 130 to 150 kilos, you start to see this a little bit more, that the precision fat pigs tend to be a little bit more fat, but it's still not much as you expect. And I don't have the answer to you how we will play yet with this diets, but we will be changing the amino acid energy ratios of these diets and trying and adjust for these animals.
Yeah. In other words, I need to be more patient.
Yes, Dr. Patient.
I want, but I asked you that question in part, Aline, because the nature of the research you're doing work with stable isotope work, you're doing proteomic work, that if anybody was in a position to answer that question, right, you have the research tools to do that. So we'll keep an eye on your research going forward to see what findings that you have there. So thank you very much for that. But let's move on then, and let's talk about some of your specific research and some of your recent findings, or some of the findings that you think are most significant, that you think our audience would be most interested in.
So I will start, as you said that you're a big fan of modeling, I will start by the modeling work, because I think it's where we're probably missing a little bit of people working in this field. We have discussed this a little bit. But one of the things that we have noticed is, to do precision feeding, you have to use models that are really developed for that end. So we have compared, for example, trying to use the NRC model to do precision feeding in growing finishing pigs versus our precision fed model, or even the model of the Brazilian tables. And we compared to see what would happen. And traditional models will always overestimate the average pig because they're calibrated to have a safety margin. They're calibrated for populations. So if you try and do precision feeding,
yes.
So if you try and do precision feeding with the NRC models, you always will overestimate your average pig by 15%. So you have to be very careful with that. You may try and adjust that model to do multi-phase feeding, because is when we're working, instead of working with the average pig, we're working with 80% of our population. Our estimate in multi-phase feeding, what we do is we take the average pig plus 15%, and then we consider that by doing that, we are feeding more or less 80% of our population according to their requirements. We're missing 20% of this population, but it would be too expensive actually to try and feed all our pigs to the requirements in the multi-phase feeding system, where we're feeding a group.
Yeah, excuse me, Aline. I think that was something you said there was really important, and I think would be certainly of interest to me. And that was if you formulate your diet, let's say you're conventional feeding right now, and if you define your requirement to be approximately 15% above what the defined requirement is, that will catch, you said about 80% of the pigs in the population. So that's a question that comes up so often, right? And when feed prices are high and market prices are low, which pig do I feed, right? Or when feed prices are low and market prices are high, which pig do I feed? So requirement plus 15% catches 80% of the pigs. I think that's a good thumb rule for us to understand, irrespective of precision feeding.
Yeah. But you should be careful, because if you're taking, for example, the NRC model, the average is already that. So you should be feeding 80% of your population to the requirement.
With the existing NRC model. Gotcha. Okay.
If you have no sanitary challenge in your barn, so we're talking like in a very good condition sanitary barn, where we don't have stress, we don't have challenge, you should be getting around 80% of that population.
Very good. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, but that was a good point I just wanted to emphasize. So please continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay. Thank you. And so one of the things that we have noticed is if you try and do individual precision feeding with the NRC model, with the Brazilian tables, you will be overfeeding your population. You'll be very safe, but you're not going to save as much as in costs. When we look for the precision feeding model versus a 3-phase feeding system, what we see is a decrease in feeding costs by 12%. So in Canadian dollars, the time that we did that calculation, which was 2015, I think, was $8 to $12 per pig. So looking to the costs today that we have, you could probably be more towards the $12 per pig saving in feed. And this will also decrease a lot the environmental costs. So I think that was a very good take on that one. So which animal you feed, where you're feeding your animal tells you a lot. Another point is we have shown that the threonine and methionine ratios for precision fed pigs are slightly above those that we normally use for conventional feeding. This happened because when we're doing precision feeding, we're decreasing the lysine but depending the phase feeding, we're decreasing some 17 to 27% lysine in the diet. And by formulating using the ideal protein ratio, we're also decreasing all the other amino acids in the same proportion. And when I say ideal protein profile, we should be putting this in quotes because it depends what you're looking for. So in the precision feeding, we have seen that we can decrease lysine by 27% in relation to the phase feeding without any problems, but you cannot decrease in the same amount the threonine and lysine. You have to be a bit more conservative with these amino acids. So in the end, you will reduce also threonine and lysine in relation to what we give to the group phase feeding, but it will be less than the amount of lysine that we're reducing. So by the end, we have different ratios. So when we're applying this to the field, you should be very careful which ratios are using. And when I'm talking about amino acid ratios, I'm not talking about the NRC ratios. I'm talking about the IRA ratios that are already higher. So if you think the IRA ratio, threonine to lysine requirement for a 25 50 kilopics is 65, while the NRC is 60. So in the ideal, in the precision feeding system, you should be going above 65 relationship threonine to lysine if you're bringing the system to the field.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So that is one of our take homes. Another one that's I'm not hiding is one of my favorites. Is a study of Dr. Salgado. He did his PhD on that, and we try to understand why finishing pigs have different fat depositions. Why we have pigs that have the same genetic, the same potential of growth, they have the same weight when we start the trial. We feed them the exactly same diet, but they don't respond equally to the same diet. So what they're doing with that? So we labeled glucose. We fed these animals with enough glucose only, and we injected glucose, a bolus of glucose in this labeled glucose in these animals, and then we study how much lipids each one of these animals were depositing, and how was the gene machinery working behind it. And what we have seen is that we have our pigs, our finishing pigs, we're talking pigs above 90 kilograms of body weight. They have different body conditions because they have difference of insulin sensitivity. So they have the same genetics, but their metabolism is not working equally. And when I repeat this experiment and I labeled valine and I looked at the animals, a high protein deposition pig has a 40% greater insulin sensibility than an animal that has low protein deposition. And they're receiving the same thing. They're all equal. And we did with males and females. So 2 trials different. We use different terms to select these animals. So we see that they are using differently these nutrients. And when we look at what is happening behind of that, so we did a transcriptomic study, and we have seen that for low protein deposition pigs, they had genes related to oxidative stress, immune response. So all these things that we know that in the background are taking energy away of these animals, are taking amino acids away from the protein synthesis and deposition, and they are using for other things. So that's very interesting. And we're trying to see how we'll integrate all that in our model to do what we now are aiming to do, that is precision nutrition instead of precision feeding, where we go and try to modulate the growth of these animals to have more homogeneous carcass in the end. Carcass that have a greater protein content, a greater value to the market, maybe modulate the growth of these animals. We know that there are some markets that like to have a little bit more of a fat in the middle of the muscles, intramuscular fat, while other markets like very lean meat. So how can we try and modulate the growth of these animals? And more than that, how can we actually help the animals when they're in a bad situation? One thing that our lab is working and will be working in the next 5 years is early disease detection. When we're working with the precision feeding system, we have real-time feeding behavior and feed intake of these animals. So we normally can see that an animal is getting sick 2 to 3 days before he has any clinical symptoms. So before he has a fever or anything, he changes the way not only the amount, but the behavior itself. So we're trying to develop an algorithm in collaboration with the University of Wales to predict when these animals will be sick. And this could help us to isolate the first animals that are that sick. If we can detect them, we can isolate them. We can save a lot of costs because of giving antibiotics to all the animals. We'll be only giving antibiotics for those animals that need, right? So we avoid that this disease is spreading in our barn and causing that nightmare that is the contagion that happens. And I have some colleagues that have been working when the animal is sick, which are the techniques that we can use, which are how we can modify the diet to help these animals to get better. So we're talking about target treatment, which means that we identify early this animal is getting sick, and then we already modify their diets. And this modification can be amino acids, functional amino acids, can be maybe we need to introduce a medicated feed only for those animals. So the feed can detect each one of the animals and provide a treated feed only for the animals that need. So
what's going through my mind as you're describing some of your research, Aline, is that the work that you're doing in order to enhance your capabilities in precision feeding gives us just really enhanced understanding of normal metabolism, or even metabolism under less normal conditions. So, for example, the work on glucose utilization and insulin sensitivity will help us to better understand energy utilization in the pig, which obviously has huge financial implications. So, so that's, it, like so many areas of endeavor, the new knowledge that comes out on the side, so to speak, is valuable as much as maybe the original intent, and that's the joy of science. But before we leave this, and you've given some great examples of some of the work you're doing, Aline, can you help us to understand a little bit about the environmental implications of what you're doing at Sherbrooke?
The precision feeding can help us to decrease crude protein on the diet, phosphorus, and can also help us to decrease the lysine in the diet. And by better adjusting these diets daily to each one of the animals, we can reduce the protein intake by 40%, and discretion more or less in the same amount. So we have a reduction in nitrogen excretion that is phenomenal, actually. If you're thinking 40% nitrogen excretion reduction, we have similar numbers in phosphorus, but phosphorus is a colleague of mine, Dr. Motonini, here from the University of Laval, that works on it. And she'll tell you that phosphorus is a little bit more complicated than that because there is a depletion-repletion mechanism. So I'm not going to get in this part. But we can decrease the environmental impact related to nitrogen excretion, phosphorus excretion, but we also can decrease CO2, the carbon emission. When we look, we did a life cycle assessment, and we use the Quebec scenario. And that, be aware, every time that you're doing a life cycle assessment, your assessment is only as good as your scenario. So I can only infer for what we would see here in Quebec, in a case where the corn is produced here, the soybean is produced here, and the wheat is produced here. But if we would be bringing part of these materials from the Midwest, we'll be seeing Midwest from the United States, we'll see similar results because the impact is very close. But we have seen a reduction in carbon emissions by 5%. We have seen a reduction in eutrophication by 17%, which is quite impressive because normally when we're working with big productions, there is very little that we can do to reduce our CO2 emissions or carbon emissions, because it is a system that normally is quite good in terms of carbon emission, right? We don't have a huge methane emission or anything. But one of the boundaries problems that we have seen with our system is that most of the life cycle assessments, they do not account for spreading the manure. They account when we arrive the manure in the field and we put there. But all the emissions that come out after are not accounted. So if we, in the coming steps, we're accounting for these emissions, and we expect that the contribution to reduce carbon emissions of the precision feeding system will be even bigger than what we're seeing. We are quite confident that we can go closer to 10% of carbon emissions decrease in the system. And another thing to add is that the Quebec scenario is already very low emissions. So if we're talking, if we're applying the same system in Europe, you'd see an even bigger reduction in environmental impact, because normally, while here in Quebec, we see a 2.2 CO2 equivalents per kilogram of pork. In Europe, you're going to see 3.4, 3.5. So our Canadian systems are quite good. They're already quite environmentally friendly because most of our products come from Canada or come from the United States. So our CO2 emissions are not that high during winter, or we don't have so much emissions from the fields or from the manure. So it's already a system that is quite good on that. We have a high efficiency. Normally we have very good feed efficiency. So this, for me, seeing a 5%, I know that many people were expecting more, but honestly, we have a 5% CO2 emission in a system that is already good. With the knowledge that we have today, I can't wait to see what we can do in 10 years. I cannot, with the knowledge that we acquire. And so I'm very excited for what is to come.
Right on. I can understand why. So let's, unfortunately, our time has moved on. And perhaps we could wrap it up with what you think are some of the important take-home messages, both of what you've maybe talked about today, but also just generally in the whole area of precision feeding of grow-finished pigs, Aline.
So first, one of the limitations that we have today is the availability of equipment. So that we have to work closely with our industry partners to bring this to the field. We have to show them the advantage. You have to work with them to make this a reality. For the producers, I think one of the things that has scared them the most is the amount of technology that is involved on that. But I want to remember them that the new generations of swine producers, they are born with cell phones in their hands. And I think they will welcome a different way to produce pigs, a way that is closer to their abilities. And I think will help the producers to deal a lot with the problems of manpower that we're having. But to be able to do that, what we need on is train, capable people train. Us in the research centers, universities, we have to be training our students to have a different look at nutrition, to be ready to go to the field and implement this types of technologies, to have a different view of how we feed animals and stop just thinking in the average pig. We have to start to look to the outliers. We have to start to look why we have so much variability in our population and how we can feed these animals in a way that we're decreasing costs for the producers, in a way that we're decreasing environmental impact, but that is still welfare acceptable for our animals, right? So my take-home message is, if I want anyone to remember anything, is that precision feeding can decrease the environmental impact, can decrease feed costs by 12%, and it can help us to have new generations of producers in the field.
Great. Well, that's quite a an opportunity that presents itself before us, and underscores how important the research that you're doing in Sherbrooke is in terms of the future of the pig industry. So thank you very much. Today we've had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Aline Remus from Sherbrooke, from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the research center there, and talking about precision feeding of grow-finished pigs. I'm John Patience, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.